A notorious womanizer, Xerxes' affair with his own niece went too far. When his wife heard, she wanted to punish him, but the King of Kings was untouchable, so she devised an even more disturbing plan for revenge. Xerxes the Great was the fourth King of Kings who ruled the Achaemenid Empire of Persia, known in the modern day for fighting the Greeks, as well for his battle-hardened feats and massive stone structures that he left behind. In life, Xerxes spent much of his reign embroiled in a lethal and surprisingly devious Game of Thrones. Xerxes I was born circa 518 BCE. Though his father ruled, it was from his mother that Xerxes received his ordained royalty. She was Atossa, a daughter of the founder of the empire, Cyrus the Great. Back then, life was hard, even for a prince. But from day one, Xerxes assumed the role of the protagonist in his dramatic, adventurous life. Xerxes was named in the language of his empire, Old Iranian. Transliterated from that ancient tongue, his name means ruling over heroes. It prophesied his role leading brave soldiers in great battles later in life. As the first of his name, he set a noble precedent too. Such was the reputation the brave king would later make for himself, that his name became a staple of ancient Persian culture. Xerxes became a popular moniker for multiple rulers of the Achaemenid Empire for many successive generations. Xerxes lived thousands of years ago, so records of his life, and especially his childhood, are sparse, though unearthed ancient Greek dialogues have described the typical upbringing of Persian princes. From these sources, we can say with some likelihood that Xerxes was raised by eunuchs, powerful religious figures dedicated to the royal family. But don't picture some dainty, spoiled prince. Xerxes' upbringing was intense. At the young age of 7, Persian princes, and therefore most likely the case with Xerxes, learned to ride horses and hunt game, preparing them for survival on the battlefield. But Persian princes needed brain and bronze. By the age of 14, Xerxes would have begun education in courtly matters. 4 aristocratic teachers taught him how to be wise, just, prudent, and brave. Throughout his education, Xerxes probably learned the ways of Zoroastrian religion too. The tenets of this faith taught young princes to be truthful, courageous, and self-restraining. It also propagandized them into battle readiness with honestly very cool slogans like, "Fear for a Persian is the equivalent of slavery." It was a good lesson to teach the young prince. Later in life, Xerxes would face fear like he never dreamed of. The Achaemenid Empire had an impressive knack for integrating rulers with their people, because at around 16 years old, princes like Xerxes had to partake in 10 long years of national service. During this decade, the young prince would have learned archery and spear throwing for the purposes of hunting and war, fostered through a sense of friendly competition with his peers. But Xerxes' training still did not end there. If you thought the national service was long, in his mid to late 20s, Xerxes began the mandatory 25-year military service of all Persian princes. If he had completed the assignment, he would have achieved the status of elder and would have served the king as an advisor. However, Xerxes' sudden ascension to the throne cut his service short, but he may not have learned everything he needed to know. While Xerxes' education was broad, with many learned skills transferable to his later position, it was unclear whether he ever learned to read or write. These abilities did not hold much importance, as they do in our modern world, to Persian culture at the time. They relied more on oral culture to pass on stories and wisdom than on written records and literature. It's actually a large factor in why we don't know much about the prince's early life. One historical record from the Achaemenid Empire suggests that Xerxes resided in the royal palace of Babylon from around the age of 20. This would have been during his national service, and he perhaps lived there as a ward the ruler of the city. His father may have sent him away to focus on other matters that needed attention. Xerxes' father, Darius, presided over an incredibly tumultuous period for the Achaemenid Empire. The later days of his rule became characterized by a huge mobilization with the intention of declaring war on Greece. However, due to Darius' heavy tax policies on Egypt and his unrestrained appropriation of their craftsmen to build Persian palaces, a revolt broke out there in 486 BCE. He didn't know it yet, but the revolt would spell the beginning of Xerxes' destiny. Preparing to march on Egypt, Darius required an heir before he left, on the contingency that he perished in battle. He opted to name Xerxes as his successor. His choice ignited controversy immediately. Xerxes was actually his second son. His first son, Artabazon, was Xerxes' half-brother, but he was born to a commoner mother. And as if the flames of a succession crisis didn't need flaming, Darius didn't stay around much longer either. Darius' health had been failing as he planned his campaign to quell the revolts in Egypt, and he succumbed suddenly to his ailments before he even had a chance to leave. He perished at the age of 64 in October of 486 BCE. Xerxes was now the king, according to Darius' wishes. But of course, the Game of Thrones isn't quite so simple. Artabazon immediately attempted to claim the throne as Darius' eldest son, but Xerxes had a convincing counterclaim: his mother. As mentioned, Atossa was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, the founding emperor of the Achaemenids who had won the Persians their freedom. Xerxes argued this blood connection made him the rightful heir over his half-brother, and he had some surprising allies backing up his claim. Interestingly, Xerxes' claim found support at court with Demaratus, the Spartan king of Eurypontid. Demaratus was in exile and taken refuge in Persia, where he served as an advisor to the Achaemenid dynasty. Taking Xerxes' side, the Spartan argued that the eldest son did not have universal claim. In fact, under Spartan law, the throne went to the first son born to the father, while he was king. Darius had not yet ascended to the throne when Xerxes' half-brother was born, and therefore, Xerxes' claim was stronger. The court had heard enough. Xerxes won the day, and he was crowned sometime near the end of 486 BCE, at around the age of 32. His mother, Atossa, and her great authority at court were instrumental in the smooth transition of power. No one inside or outside the palace challenged Xerxes' ascension, but the king needed a queen. Not long after his ascension, Xerxes married his cousin, which was a common practice, a mistress. She and Xerxes had 5 children together. But this king of kings liked to get around, and Xerxes also sired at least 4 other children with unknown wives or mistresses. The king and queen were ready to rule their vast empire. Xerxes inherited an incredibly far-reaching empire, made up of multiple ethnicities. He appears to have been relatively skillful at maintaining unity among these populations, as soldiers of many different nationalities served in his army. He was politically astute in other ways as well. Evidence suggests Xerxes was a firm believer in the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda. However, he presided over an empire made up of many different religious groups and treated them all with respect. Xerxes skillfully appealed to local religious scholars when courting favor in more remote regions of the empire, and even made sacrifices to local deities. That was the carrot he offered, but he also had the stick, and he could be brutal with it. The situation faced by his father in Egypt was still tense when Xerxes ascended, and another revolt soon broke out in the region. The young king was eager to prove himself, and personally led his men to restore order to the region. He brutally suppressed the revolt in January 484 BC, destroying Egyptian religious temples as retribution. But that wasn't the end of it. He had to make some subsequent political moves to keep the region in line. After crushing the Egyptian revolt, the region was conveniently left without anyone to govern it, as the previous governor had perished in the battle. Xerxes moved to secure the region for the Achaemenids by supporting his brother as new governor of Egypt. But the campaign came at a serious cost. Though the suppression of Egypt was successful, it nonetheless took its toll on Xerxes' forces. The army his father had mobilized to send into Greece was now significantly weakened. Xerxes, who had intended on going ahead with his father's intended expedition into Europe, had to put his plans on hold to raise a new army, a project which took 4 years. And like a game of whack-a-mole, when one revolt was put down, another popped up somewhere across the empire. More unrest broke out in Xerxes' reign, this time in Babylon. Though the initial revolt, which broke out in July of 484 BC, was short-lived, it apparently only took 2 weeks to suppress. A second, however, broke out 2 years later. The cause is unknown, though it was likely due to tax increases implemented to rebuild Xerxes' army. This second revolt proved more difficult to suppress, taking almost a year. Xerxes once again had to guarantee peace in the region, so he put his foot down. Before the revolts, Babylon appeared to have occupied a special place in the Achaemenid Empire. Achaemenid kings held the titles of King of the Lands, but also a separate title, King of Babylon, implying the region existed as something of a separate entity, united in a personal union with the Achaemenids. Following the revolts, however, Xerxes dropped this title and divided the Babylonian territory into smaller subunits to pacify the region. But he still needed to send a message, and the message he sent was brutal. Some sources claim Xerxes' revenge on the Babylonians did not stop a territorial division. Accounts emerged of a brutal crackdown exerted by the king, where he destroyed buildings, damaged temples, and even stole a sacred statue of the god Marduk, which he melted down. However, modern scholars have disputed the validity of these accusations, dismissing them as made-up stories derived from anti-Persian sentiment. Xerxes wasn't just continuing his father's plans to invade Greece in tribute to his old man. The Achaemenids had a score to settle with the Athenians, Naxians, and Eretrians after these Greek city-states had successfully revolted against Persian rule during Darius' reign. Xerxes felt he had inherited the task of punishing them, something he was already plenty good at. He set out to ensure the campaign would run as smoothly as possible. Xerxes did not limit his preparations for the invasion to simply shoring up his armies. He literally moved heaven and earth to smooth the journey to Greece. Well, the earth part, at least. He oversaw the digging of the Xerxes Canal through the Mount Athos Peninsula, had provisions brought ahead and stored along the route, and built 2 bridges across the Hellespont Strait. All this meant he also had to confront some serious challenges from Mother Nature. According to a Greek historian, Xerxes' first attempt at bridging the Hellespont Strait failed after a storm completely destroyed the construction project. Hilariously, an angered Xerxes ordered a sharp punishment on the strait itself. He had the Hellespont whipped 300 times and even ordered his men to throw ankle shackles into the water. You may laugh, but the strait apparently learned its lesson as the second attempt at the bridge was successful. The stage was set. Xerxes was not the type of ruler to just send men to die from the comfort of his palace. With the construction projects completed, in the spring of 480 BCE, Xerxes personally led his army across the Hellespont into Europe. But a thing few people realize is, things got off to a good start. The Persians looked to be at an advantage as the campaign commenced. Xerxes and his army handily won their first few conflicts, including a large naval battle. The fates seemed to be on Xerxes' side, and there were domestic factors that put the Greeks at a serious disadvantage. Xerxes' invasion seemed well timed. The Greek region was still reeling from a recent Carthaginian invasion of Sicily, which had significantly weakened 2 powerful regional monarchs, preventing them from offering support to the Greeks in Xerxes' warpath. On top of that, many smaller Greek states saw the writing on the wall and decided to side with the Persians. It must have seemed wise when they saw Xerxes' army. Between the fleet and the army, Xerxes' forces numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 1 million combatants, a staggeringly sized force for the era. His numbers included an elite fighting force of around 10,000 men, known as the Immortals. Still, the Greeks put up a fight. One of the most famous battles of the campaign was the Battle of Thermopylae. Fictionalized in the 2006 movie 300, Xerxes' forces faced off against the famous Spartans, led by King Leonidas. Legend has it that the Spartan force numbered only around 300 men, hence the movie title, and actually managed to hold their own against the massive Persian force. But you didn't see what happened next in the movie. The Persians won the day in the end, resulting in the capture of the city of Athens. Following the destruction of Athens, Xerxes seemed unstoppable. The Persians now controlled most of the Greek mainland, an impressively sizable landmass. But the king was getting cocky. With most of the land conquered, Xerxes now set his sights on the Greek fleet. However, A Greek advisor counseled the king to send part of his fleet to the Peloponnesus. The conditions for a naval engagement were unfavorable, and the advisor thought it would be best to await the dissolution of the remaining Greek armies. Xerxes ordered his entire fleet to engage the Greek navy in what became known as the Battle of Salamis. It was a disastrous mistake. The Greek fleet, with something of a home advantage in the poor conditions, trounced the Persians. The decisive defeat meant Xerxes suddenly found himself on the back foot. He began to fear that the Greeks would attempt to trap his army in Europe by destroying the Hellespont bridges. The risk was too great, and Xerxes finally decided to retreat back to Asia, taking the bulk of his army with him. Xerxes' attempts to finish what his father started had failed miserably. Now he needed a new project. Now back home in Asia with a humiliating defeat under his belt, Xerxes set about trying to mend his legacy. He dedicated the remainder of his life to large-scale construction projects, some new and some that his father had left unfinished. Among the impressive structures of the era were the Gate of All Nations and the Palace of Darius. He felt he had to one-up his last one, however. Xerxes also had his own palace built, and he specifically insisted that it be twice the size of his father's. Though the two men had a similar taste in architecture, Xerxes had a much grander sense of scale than his dad, and ensured all structures he oversaw were imposing and colorful. Xerxes may not have been the conqueror he hoped, but he proved competent at his governing duties, ensuring the upkeep of everyday infrastructure across the empire. In particular, he personally oversaw regular maintenance of the Royal Road, an ancient trade highway built by his father. But none of this was enough to save him in the end. By August of 465 BCE, Xerxes was no more. The king was suddenly slain at the age of only 53. Adding to the tragedy, his eldest son and heir, Darius II, also croaked around the same time. The precise details of the ordeal are lost in the fog of time, but it appears that Xerxes was betrayed by one of the men he trusted most. Historical records seem to point to the commander of Xerxes' royal bodyguard, Artabanus, as the culprit behind the assassination, with the help of a trusted eunuch. Artabanus was a popular figure at court. He was well liked among the religious elements and seemed to have engaged in intrigue around the harems of the palace too. Furthermore, through his powers as commander of the royal bodyguard, he had positioned his 7 sons in key positions at court, vying to take the throne for himself. One detail, however, is unclear. Ancient accounts differ on the fate of Xerxes' son on the day of the assassination. According to one source, Artabanus accused the king's heir of murdering his father, then convinced Darius' brother to slay him in revenge. A brutal intrigue, but it may have been simpler. Even simpler. Another account accuses Artabanus of simply killing Darius II first, and then killing Xerxes. After Artaxerxes discovered the plot, he allegedly slayed Artabanus and all his sons. Regardless of Darius' role, it appears this last part was true, as Artaxerxes ultimately ascended to the throne. Aside from his defeats in Greece, an alleged low point for Xerxes on a personal level was a problem concerning his affairs. A devoted womanizer, Xerxes began an affair with his niece, Artainete. When Xerxes' wife heard of the affair, she ordered Artainete's mother to be brutally mutilated in revenge. But it didn't stop there. When Xerxes' brother understandably went on the warpath, Xerxes not only offed said brother, but also his nephews and every last man who rallied to their cause. Of course, we have to remember that the source for this story was the Greek Herodotus, whose histories have to be taken with a few grains of salt. As the Persians were a largely oral culture, much of what we know about Xerxes actually comes from Greek and Roman historians, and therefore should come with a pinch of salt. Indeed, many sources depict him negatively, which makes sense. He was an enemy of Greece, and at one point threatened their very existence. Still, it says a lot about Xerxes' skills, even when his haters had to admit he knew what he was doing most of the time. One mistake on a campaign cost Xerxes dearly. On their way into Greece, Xerxes' army had cleaned out the land of food. Even Xerxes himself wound up going hungry, allegedly surviving on bark and roots on the way home. That is going to bring us to the end of the video on Xerxes. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like rating, subscribe for more, comment below, and we'll be back with a brand new video on a new historical figure very soon.